diskusinya. Jadi kita tunggu dulu sekitar 15 menit, nanti kita obrol-obrol soal argumentasi ontologis buat keberadaan Tuhan. Oke, kita tunggu sekitar 10 menitan. Prof. Yujin. Hi. Okay, wait. I'll make you the co-host. Hey, wait. Yeah. I need to make you the co-host first, but unfortunately, I need to ask uh, my colleague what is there.
Hi.
Hi. Sorry, Prof. Yujin. Okay. So before we start, let me introduce you, and also I'll make a brief opening for today's discussion. Is it okay to start it with Indonesia, with bahasa Indonesia in Indonesian language?
Yeah.
Okay. Selamat malam semuanya. Terima kasih sudah hadir dan terima kasih buat antusias kalian untuk boleh bergabung pada malam ini di Schole, diskusi mengenai argumentasi ontologis mengenai keberadaan Tuhan di Ontological Argument for the Existence of God. Hari ini we really fortunate today to have Prof. Yujin Nagasawa, the University of Birmingham Professor of Philosophy, here to talk about ontological argument. I could say that ontological argument is one of the things that Prof. Yujin often talks, whether in his articles, publications. Also, he write a book about ontological argument and talk in some of the interviews about ontological argument. So, Prof. Yujin has written around 10 books and dozens of articles. And I would like to introduce one of his books that you could buy here in Indonesia, a very short introductions on miracles. I think this is also a good book and worth to be discussed also. Yeah, maybe we could have it to be discussed one day. So, Prof. Yujin, thank you for your consideration.
Thank you for having
to come
me.
Here in Florida. Could you share others than doing your professor at University of Birmingham? What other projects you do? You do?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you well. The connection is not good.
Sorry. Others than a professor of philosophy in Birmingham, what other projects you do?
So I do mainly philosophy of religion and philosophy of mind. And in the philosophy of mind, I'm mainly interested in the problem of consciousness. Are you hearing me okay? Is my voice echoing? Is it okay?
Okay.
Right. So in philosophy of mind, I mainly focus on the problem of consciousness. So I am currently working on several papers on this topic, but I tend to be quite busy in philosophy of religion. So right now I'm leading a project called the Global Philosophy of Religion, which is basically an attempt to make the field of philosophy of religion more global. So I really welcome this opportunity to discuss philosophy of religion with the students and scholars in Indonesia. So I appreciate this opportunity.
Yeah. I also hear that there's some fundings or grants for the translations for some project of some philosophy of religions writings. Am I right?
Yeah, that's right. So we are running several grant competitions, and one of them is for translation funding. So if you want to translate some philosophy of religion books or papers written in English into the Indonesian language or the other way around, yeah, we welcome your applications.
Yeah. So you guys could check global stripphilosophy.org/grants to see some grants that the University of Birmingham and Global Philosophy of Religion offered for the academics, also hopefully in Indonesia. So that's it. I think maybe let's jump into the questions. Prof. Yujin?
Sure.
Okay. I'll ask the first questions, the questions that we always also ask for other interviewers here. So before we talk about the ontological argument, we want to know first what philosophy is for you, and how could you first introduce to philosophy, and also why do you want to indulge in academic philosophy?
Okay, so for me, philosophy is an exploration of all the fundamental questions about reality and our existence in it. So as a teenager, I read several philosophy books, and I thought they are really fascinating because it's so different from philosophy, is so different from any other academic areas. So for example, if you study economics or biology or computer science, you don't question a lot of things. You don't wonder if the external world exists or if we have free will and so on. These are so fundamental that we don't really address them. But in philosophy, you can directly address these questions, which I thought was very interesting and also liberating as well. So in philosophy, you can defend whatever you want, any view you want, as long as you have a good argument. As long as you have an argument based on reason and logic, then your view is taken seriously, even if your view sounds initially quite crazy. And I thought this was very interesting and unique about philosophy. And I particularly like the philosophy of religion because in this area of philosophy, we address these big questions directly. So if you look at contemporary philosophy journals, you can find many papers addressing very subtle technical details of small questions, small philosophical questions. And it's important to address these small questions because in order to solve big questions about the existence of God and free will and the origin of the universe and so on, we have to first solve these small questions. But at the same time, I think contemporary philosophers tend to forget that they address these small questions because they want to solve these big questions eventually. But I think the philosophy of religion is a good reminder that we do philosophy because we really want to know about whether we have free will or who or what created the universe, or whether there is meaning in life and so on. So that's why I really like philosophy of religion, and that's why this area of philosophy has been my main area of research.
I see. Okay, that's interesting. So yeah, philosophy of religion talks a lot about big questions, and that's what you think what philosophers or philosophy should do. If I'm not. Yeah. I think that's what also one of the reasons I indulge in philosophy of religion. Yeah, it's really fun to talk about big questions here. Could you share why do you want to be an academician, especially an academic in philosophy department?
Yeah, so when I read these, introductory philosophy books as a student, I thought, this is something that I really want to do. And I thought it was almost too good to be true that someone can just explore these questions and get paid for that. So academics like myself often complain about our jobs. So we say, there are a lot of committee meetings at the university and we have to mark a big pile of student essays and so on. But I still think that we are extremely fortunate that we can make a living, working on these interesting philosophical questions and discussing these questions with bright students, and also we can publish our work so that the people around the world can read them. And I still think that every day I feel that I'm very fortunate to have this job, and I wouldn't really want to do anything else, really. I think it's a very interesting job to have.
Okay, thank you for sharing it. Maybe I want to translate it to Indonesia roughly. Jadi teman-teman, apa sih filsafat itu? Kalau buat Prof Yujin, filsafat itu adalah sebuah usaha untuk mempertanyakan pertanyaan fundamental. Gitu. Filsafat sekarang seringkali lupa tuh ya, terlalu banyak membicarakan pertanyaan-pertanyaan yang sifatnya kecil. Itu penting gitu ya, tapi rasa-rasanya untuk melupakan pertanyaan-pertanyaan besar sayang sekali gitu ya, soal makna hidup, segala macam, keberadaan Tuhan. Makanya dia juga masuk ke dalam filsafat agama. Yang kedua, kenapa sih ke filsafat yang akademik? Karena buat dia untuk ke dalam filsafat akademik itu menyenangkan, dan dia sangat merasa beruntung untuk bisa jadi seorang akademisi dalam konteks filsafat gitu ya. Meskipun ya seringkali ada hal-hal yang menyebalkan, tapi dia selalu merasa beruntung setiap kali memikirkan punya kesempatan untuk mengajar di sebuah universitas yang specifically bahas secara filosofis, bahas filsafat gitu. Okay, so I want to go to the next questions about if we talk about the ontological argument, so we also talk about it tries to prove the existence of God. Now, my question is, what kind of God that the ontological argument wants to prove? Is it monotheistic, or also, or maybe it could be applied to the pantheistic God or panentheistic God, or any gods? Do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the ontological argument is obviously an argument for the existence of God, but it's based on a specific definition of God. So this argument was introduced by Anselm, the 11th century Christian theologian, and his definition of God was that God is something than which no greater can be thought. So God is the greatest possible being. There is no possible being that is greater than God. So if your God is not the greatest possible being, if there is a being that is greater than your God, then your God is not the real God, according to Anselm. So again, Anselm's definition is that God is something than which no greater can be thought, or God is the greatest possible being. Now, Anselm was a Christian theist, so obviously he thought that this being is this definition of God is compatible with Christian theism. So he thought that the greatest possible God as the greatest possible being should be an omniscient, omnipotent, and morally perfect being in the Christian tradition. But you mentioned pantheism, which I think is very interesting, because potentially this definition of God is compatible with pantheism, I think. So pantheists claim that basically the universe is God, or the world is God. And then they think that, God should be the most encompassing being. There is nothing beyond God, according to pantheism. So they think that perhaps God's greatness can be defined in terms of encompassment. So if there is something beyond which there is nothing, then that's God. And then pantheists think that, okay, the universe is all there is. There's nothing beyond the universe. Therefore, the universe is God. And, you could argue that pantheism is compatible with the Anselmian definition, because again, Anselm says that God is the greatest possible being. And as a pantheist, you might say, okay, the greatest possible being is the universe, because again, there's nothing beyond the universe. Another view that I'm quite interested in is called modal panentheism. And according to this view, God is identical with logical space. And logical space encompasses absolutely everything, not just this universe and you and me, but also all sorts of imaginary and even, currently non-existent beings. So like fictional characters like Sherlock Holmes, or non-existent animals like flying pigs and so on. So logical space includes absolutely everything, not just actual beings, but non-actual beings as well. And again, you might say, okay, there is nothing beyond the logical space. So logical space is the most encompassing being. Therefore, if we define God's greatness in terms of encompassment, then maybe logical space is God. And arguably, this kind of view is compatible with the definition of God underlying the ontological argument, which again says that God is something than which no greater can be thought.
I see. So the definition that Anselm gives, you think could also encompass another types of God that you show. Okay, I'll translate a bit for the Indonesians. Jadi teman-teman, menarik banget nih. Kalau ngomongin argumen ontologis itu kan argumen yang sebenarnya buat Anselmus itu ditujukan buat Tuhan yang sifatnya monoteistik gitu ya, Tuhannya Kristen lah. Anselmus kan semacam uskup gitu. Tapi kalau melihat definisinya, kalau membuktikan Tuhan yang the greatest possible being that could be imagined, Tuhan yang mungkin ada yang paling mungkin, yang paling hebat untuk bisa dipikirkan, itu ternyata bisa masuk ke aspek-aspek jenis Tuhan yang lain gitu loh, kayak panteisme gitu ya, Tuhan sebagai daripada alam semesta, atau bahkan tadi logical space model panentheism gitu ya, Tuhan yang bukan cuma ada di dalam semesta, tapi bahkan Tuhan yang melingkupi seluruh keberadaan dan bahkan ketidakberadaan. Wah, ini menarik banget sih untuk diperbincangkan. Okay, so thank you. I think it's really interesting to talk about the third type of God. What's it called?
Model panentheism. Yeah.
I see. Model panentheism. Have you read some articles about this?
Yeah, I have written a paper on this view. It's a quite unusual view, and I don't think anyone explicitly defends this view. And I think it has a certain problem, but I think it's still an interesting view that can be explored.
Yeah, it's great. So, another questions regarding your regarding ontological arguments. There are dozens of arguments like cosmological argument, teleological argument, and moral arguments, and other arguments for the existence of God. So why do you prefer to talk explicitly about ontological argument in your books? Also, I think a lot in your articles you talk a lot about ontological arguments. What do you think about it compared to other arguments, and why you have that kind of you really like to talk about ontological arguments a lot. Why?
Good. So, I'm quite unusual because I really like the ontological argument, and the ontological argument is not necessarily the most popular argument for the existence of God. And as you said, there is the cosmological argument, for example. So this argument, there are many versions of the cosmological argument, but one of them says something like this. So there are a lot of events in the universe, and there is a chain of events. So a certain event is caused by another event, and that event is caused by another event, and so on. And in order to stop this infinite regress, we have to assume the existence of the ultimate cause of all the events, or the ultimate cause of the universe. And then the cosmological argument says, okay, this ultimate cause must be God. Another popular argument for the existence of God is the teleological argument, which you also mentioned. And this argument says that if we look at things in nature, and they are very impressive and also complex as well. So there are amazing animals and plants and all sorts of things. And it's reasonable to assume that given their complexity and given how perfectly functioning they are, it's reasonable to assume that they are designed by some intelligent designer. And probably the intelligent designer is God, according to the teleological argument. So these arguments are quite popular, but I think in one sense, these arguments are not very clean. Firstly, because they are based on empirical observations. So they are a posteriori arguments, as philosophers say. They are based on empirical observations of the world. the observation of the universe or observation of biological organisms and so on. And it's quite controversial how to interpret these empirical observations. But the ontological argument is a purely a priori argument. It's a pure logical argument. So it doesn't rely on any observations. So you don't need any telescope or microscope to defend the ontological argument. And that's why this argument, the ontological argument, is sometimes called an armchair proof of the existence of God. So you can just sit down and analyze the concept of God, and then you can prove the existence of God. So you might think that that's too good to be true, but at the same time, it's a clean argument. It's a purely logical argument, which I like about. Another point is that the cosmological argument and the teleological argument, even if they are successful, they don't really prove the existence of God. So if the cosmological argument is sound, then all it proves is that there is the ultimate cause of the universe. So, and you can question whether the ultimate cause of the universe should be what theists call God. And also the teleological argument as well. So if this argument is sound, then it proves the existence of an intelligent designer of nature. But again, you can wonder, is this really God? Can it be an intelligent alien or some other supernatural being? So there are impressive arguments, but they are not exactly arguments for the very existence of God. And if you look at the ontological argument, this is an argument for the existence of God, because the whole argument is, as I mentioned earlier, based on the very definition of God accepted among, I would say, most theists. So God is the greatest possible being, and that's, it's quite uncontroversial that this is a good definition of God among theists. So if the argument is successful, then it seems to prove the existence of God, not just an intelligent designer or the ultimate cause of the universe. So that's why I like the ontological argument in comparison with other theistic arguments.
Would you like to see that ontological argument is stronger than other arguments?
That I would say so, but probably many philosophers would disagree. Because, okay, the ontological argument is, again, I think it's a logically clean argument, and it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly what is wrong with it. But critics would say that there are some problems, philosophical and logical problems in the argument.
Okay. Please let me translate it. Jadi teman-teman, menarik lagi nih argumen Yujin nih, ontological argument ini salah satu argumen yang paling kuat. Kenapa? Karena argumen ini menyasar satu definisi mengenai Tuhan yang eksplisit, the greatest possible being that could be imagined, the maximal great being. Nah, jadi ini adalah konsep Tuhan yang paling sesuai sama konsep-konsep Tuhannya teisme pada umumnya. Itu dibandingin sama cosmological sama teleological. Bisa aja cosmological sama teleological membuktikan keberadaan yang lebih daripada manusia. Tapi jangan-jangan bukan Tuhan yang maximally great being. Nah, gitu. Jadi buat dia justru ontological argument ini argumen yang paling kuat, gitu, menarik nih. Nah, sekarang kita mau lihat kira-kira bentuknya gimana sih. So, Prof. Yujin, what is ontological argument and how does it sound? Could you share it in some premises maybe? Yeah.
Okay, so there are largely two versions of the ontological argument. The first version is what I call the classical Anselmian ontological argument. So this is the main argument that Anselm defends in his book called the Proslogion. So this argument goes something like this. So God is, again, by definition, the greatest possible being, or something than which no greater can be thought. Now, suppose, for the sake of argument, that this being doesn't exist. But then we can derive a contradiction, because if this being doesn't exist, then we can imagine a being that is greater than this being, namely the same being that exists in reality. And this kind of argument is what philosophers called a reductio absurdum. So you make a certain assumption, and from this assumption, we derive a contradiction, and then we conclude that this assumption was false. So here again, let me repeat this again. So we make the assumption that God doesn't exist. God as the greatest possible being doesn't exist, then we can derive a contradiction, which is that there is a being greater than God. This means that our assumption was false. It's false that God doesn't exist in reality. God does exist in reality. So that's Anselm's classical ontological argument. The other version of the argument is called the modal ontological argument. And it goes something like this. So suppose that I'm a theist and you are an atheist. And then I say to you, do you think God exists? And you say, of course not. I'm an atheist. I don't think God exists. And then I say, do you think it is possible that God exists? And you might say, yeah, it is possible in principle that God exists. I'm an atheist, so I don't think God exists in reality, but it is in principle possible that there is God who created the universe. And then I would say, okay, what is God? Who or what is God? God is, again, the greatest possible being, and the greatest possible being should be a necessary being. People like us and our planet and tables and chairs, they are contingent beings. We just exist by chance. For example, if our parents hadn't met, we wouldn't have existed. So we are contingent beings, but God shouldn't be a contingent being. God is the greatest possible being. So God is a necessary being. God exists necessarily, which means that, okay, as an atheist, you have agreed that it is possible that God as a necessary being exists. Now, according to modal logic system S5, okay, it's a little bit technical, but according to this specific logical system, if something is possibly necessary, that's simply necessary. So you have agreed that it is possible that necessarily God exists, but that's logically, from this we can logically derive that necessarily God exists. So if you have possibly necessarily P, we can simply conclude that necessarily P. So if it is possible that necessarily God exists, then it simply means that necessarily God exists. But if God necessarily exists, then God exists in all possible situations, in all possible worlds, including this very actual world. So God does exist in reality. So in a way, it's a little bit like a theist's trick. So by agreeing that it is possible that God exists, you have to agree with me that there is God. God exists necessarily. So that's the modal ontological argument.
It's really interesting. I mean, it's really we could do the argument, the proof. We could try to prove God only from from some premises that we do in our thought. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So when we say that God is possible, it means at the same time we say that God is necessarily exists. If I
right. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay. Please let me translate other one more. Jadi teman-teman ini menarik banget nih. Jadi argumen ontologi ini begini. Jadi ada dua tipe, yang klasik sama yang tipe baru lah, kontemporer ya, modal ontological argument. Kita bahas yang kedua aja deh. Jadi andaikan bahwa ada seorang ateis, kita tanya, kamu percaya nggak Tuhan itu ada? Enggak, kan gue ateis. Terus yang ateis jawab, tapi mungkin nggak Tuhan ada? Mungkin, gitu. Nah, kita nanya terus, definisinya Tuhan itu apa sih? Tuhan itu adalah ada yang mungkin bisa yang dipikirkan yang paling hebat, ya nggak sih? Nah, kalau memang ia diandaikan sebagai sesuatu yang paling hebat untuk bisa dipikirkan, maka kalau ia possible, kalau ia mungkin ada, berarti ia haruslah ada. Nah, kurang lebih begitu. Nah, jadi cukup teknis, tapi anyway, ini interesting banget ya, teman-teman. Jadi lucu juga ya, contohnya itu. Bahkan ketika kita ngomong Tuhan itu mungkin ada, at the same time kita ngomong bahwa Tuhan secara niscaya itu ada. Wah, menarik. Okay, I want to go to some details at the argument's history. Can you share a bit about its historical development and the figures behind the ontological arguments? I think there's some, maybe it's not only Anselm, but also some philosophers before Anselm talk about ontological argument. And maybe in contemporary, like Alvin Plantinga or others thinker. Do you think any other philosophers still talk about this seriously? Yeah, because just what you say, a lot of people think that a lot of people talk that ontological arguments, it sounds fishy. Yeah.
Good. So again, the ontological argument was introduced by Anselm in the 11th century. I did some historical research, and it seems clear that Anselm is the very first person who introduced the ontological argument. The Anselmian definition of God was anticipated by earlier scholars, like Augustine, for example, had a very similar definition of God. But I think Anselm is the one who introduced the ontological argument itself. While he was alive, he already attracted some criticisms. So, for example, the most well-known critic then was Gaunilo, who introduced the so-called island parody objection to the ontological argument, which we might discuss a little bit later. And Aquinas, another medieval Christian theologian, he didn't accept this argument either. And then in the early modern period, Descartes revived the argument. So he introduced the Cartesian version of the ontological argument. And he thought that this is a very good argument for the existence of God. And then Leibniz, he liked the argument as well. He said that the ontological argument is very beautiful and very ingenious. And he thought that, if we add some extra sub-argument, then we can complete the ontological argument. So Leibniz thought that the ontological argument was a successful proof of the existence of God. And of course, Kant and Hume, they were critics of the ontological argument. So they introduced some powerful objections to the argument. And then there was a silence for a while, but in the 1950s and 60s, Charles Hartshorne and Norman Malcolm, these are American philosophers, and then they said that actually everyone had assumed for a long time that Anselm defended only one version of the ontological argument, the classical ontological argument. But if we look at chapter 3 of the Proslogion, we can find a different version of the ontological argument. And basically, this is the modal ontological argument. And in the 1970s, Alvin Plantinga introduced a more sophisticated version of the modal ontological argument, which has been quite influential. And as you said, this argument is not necessarily the most popular argument. And when I say that I like the argument and I even defend the argument, many philosophers are surprised. They think that it's crazy to try to defend this argument. But actually, there are a lot of prominent proponents of the argument. So as I said, Descartes, Leibniz, also Plantinga. Okay, Plantinga doesn't fully endorse this argument, but still he thought that this is a powerful argument. And also the mathematician Kurt Gödel, who proved the incompleteness theorems, he thought that the ontological argument was a successful argument. And also, even living contemporary philosophers like Mike Almeida and several other philosophers, and even William Lane Craig, whom you interviewed, he's quite sympathetic to the argument, I think. He doesn't necessarily fully endorse the argument, but he still thinks that this is a quite powerful theistic argument. So I think there are still people who take this argument seriously. But still many people think that, as you said, this argument is quite fishy. So Schopenhauer, for example, said that the ontological argument is a charming joke. So he thought that the argument is, it's a kind of clever philosophical trick, but it doesn't really prove the existence of God. And I think many philosophers would agree with that. It's a very interesting puzzle, and it's very difficult to say exactly what is wrong with it, but at the same time, it's not convincing proof of the existence of God. And my view is that, okay, the ontological argument is not the mathematical proof of the existence of God. But it's an argument for the existence of God. If you look at the set of premises, these premises are quite plausible. and the argument is logically valid, so there is no logical flaw in the argument. So I would say this is a quite powerful argument, and it has certain power to persuade some atheists potentially. And I would say this argument is as powerful as many other philosophical arguments that are considered powerful, even though it's not a definitive proof of the existence of God.
Okay, thank you. So it's really interesting. Yeah. So until now, even though there's some critics towards ontological arguments, other philosophers like you, of course, still think that ontological argument is something that really something that powerful and even useful, if I could say that, for proof the existence of God. Yeah. Okay. Let me translate it. So, jadi teman-teman, ini juga lucu ya. Jadi kata Schopenhauer, salah satu filsuf ya, ontological argument itu sebuah charming joke ya, atau lelucon yang menarik gitu. Jadi memang ada banyak yang merasa ini visi gitu ya, apa ya, kok mencurigakan gitu. Tapi banyak sampai sekarang kok filsuf yang masih bahas soal ontological argument ini. Bahkan tahun 1970-an Alvin Tantinga itu salah satu filsuf Amerika, dan bahkan bisa dibilang filsuf analitik yang besar juga ya, itu membuat argumennya menjadi lebih sophisticated. Itu yang paling baru sih gitu. Dan ya kalau teman-teman baca tulisan Prof Yujin, ya dia juga menulis secara banyak gitu ya. Kalian bisa cari artikelnya berseliweran di dia itu soal apa namanya, ontological argument. So yeah, I want to go to some critics towards ontological argument that I see a lot that oftentimes in the internet about ontological argument. So some people on the internet often talks like, if ontological arguments could prove that God exists, therefore we also could prove that any pansexual non-binary unicorn does exist. What do you think about that statement?
Good. So I think that's a version of the parody objection to the ontological argument. So as I mentioned, Anselm's contemporary called Gaunilo had the parody argument for the existence of the greatest possible island. So he said, okay, if we assume that the ontological argument is a successful proof for the existence of God, then we can prove the existence of the greatest possible island as well, because the greatest possible island that exists is greater than the greatest possible island that doesn't exist. And another interesting parody says something like this. So if the ontological argument is successful in proving the existence of God as the greatest possible being, then we can prove the existence of the worst possible being, because the worst possible being that exists is worse than the worst possible being that doesn't exist. What I find interesting about these parody objections is that, okay, it doesn't say which premise of the ontological argument is false. So it doesn't say exactly what is wrong with the argument, but at the same time, it shows, there might be something wrong somewhere in the argument, because if we accept the ontological argument, we can make a parallel absurd parody. But when it comes to, for example, the island parody, you can question whether there can be such a thing as the greatest possible island. So for example, Plantinga says that, for any island, we can always imagine an island that is greater. So, whatever an island you have, you can always add one more beautiful beach or beautiful palm tree or something like that. So there is no such thing as the greatest possible island. And another point that I want to raise is, okay, what is the greatest possible island? You might say, okay, the greatest possible island should be omnipotent, because an island that is omnipotent is greater than an island that is not omnipotent. Or maybe the greatest possible island is omniscient as well. And in the end, we might end up having just God, basically. So maybe there is no exact parody here. Maybe we end up having the ontological argument itself. Another worry that I have about the parody objection is this. So suppose that I have an argument about all possible people, and then you construct a parallel absurd parody about all possible weightlifters. But weightlifters are just only a small subset of all people. So the mere fact that you have a parallel absurd parody about weightlifters, I'm not sure if it really shows that there is something wrong with my original argument about all possible people. So the scope of the parody is much narrower than the scope of the ontological argument. So it's not so obvious that the parody, if the parody is absurd, the original argument is also absurd.
So I could say that we could not apply the ontological arguments for other substance like just what I said, non-binary pansexual, non-binary unicorn. Yeah, is it right?
So is this a pansexual non-binary unicorn? Is it meant to be, what, is it the necessary being, or is it the greatest possible pansexual non-binary unicorn? So I wonder in what sense this pansexual unicorn is analogous to God as the greatest possible being here.
Yeah, sometimes I see some people just like want to make God is something that maybe something that try to be imagined. Also the unicorn is only in our imaginations, so they have the same status, something that is only exists in imagination. Yeah, I heard some like that.
Yeah, so I think this unicorn has to be somehow, it has to be the greatest possible unicorn or greatest possible being or something like that in order to create a structurally parallel argument here. But then again, I would think that this parallel parody is not exactly analogous to the ontological argument, perhaps because the scope is a little bit different, or perhaps you have to make certain other assumptions that that proponents of the ontological argument are not committed to. But this is quite contentious because some people think that the parody objection is a successful refutation of the ontological argument.
Okay, thank you. That's, I think, about ontological argument. So I want to ask the last questions. Maybe it isn't about ontological argument itself, but I'm wondering, we oftentimes think that philosophy of religion has only one mode or method of philosophizing. That is to argue for the existence of God, or the other way around, for the non-existence of God. A more like apologetical approach. What do you think about this? Are there any modes or methods when we are talking about philosophy of religion? If there is any, what is or are the methods?
Right. So many critics think that the philosophy of religion is just apologetics in disguise. So philosophers of religion do philosophy of religion because they're only interested in proving the existence of God. Because philosophers of religion tend to be theists, and theists just want to prove the existence of God and show that atheism is false, and that's the purpose of doing philosophy of religion. And I think there is something right about their criticism. I think the philosophy of religion has been quite narrow. The coverage of this field has been quite narrow. The field has been participated by mostly, I would say, theistic philosophers in the Judeo-Christian tradition in the English-speaking part of the world. But I think the philosophy of religion is a much broader area. And, of course, Christian philosophy can be a sub-area of philosophy of religion, but there should be, the field should cover other religious traditions as well. So Islam and Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on. And also, it should, as I mentioned at the beginning, the philosophy of religion covers all sorts of big questions about the meaning of life, the foundation of morality, the origin of the universe, and so on, which are all relevant to almost everyone in any religious or even non-religious traditions. So that's why I want to globalize this area of research, because I think there's a huge potential. And this is an area of philosophy which can be contributed by philosophers from all over the world. So again, that's why I'm quite excited to speak to philosophers in Indonesia.
Okay, thank you, Prof. One of my adjunct professor in University of Indonesia is have some article that talks about animism, and I think that's quite great. If you know T.D. Smith, yeah, he writes about animism. Yeah, I think that's some other types of philosophizing in philosophy of religion.
Yeah, I think animism is a very interesting view, but it has been really neglected, even though it has been quite a common belief. You can find forms of animism in all sorts of regions in the world, but it has been completely neglected. And I think that's primarily because philosophers of religion have focused on, traditional monotheistic concept of God. So I think it would be nice to shed light on these neglected views linked to different religious traditions.
Thank you, Prof. Yujin. Maybe that's my questions, our questions, but I want to take some questions from the chat.
Sure.
I think there are some questions that sound interesting. Okay. Okay, this one is interesting from Andres Saputra. The God of theism explains that God beyond space-time, but God of pantheism explains that everything is God. How the ontological argument for the existence of God can reconcile this contradiction of definition if, as Prof. Yujin said, that God in ontological argument accommodates all definitions of God. Because I think if God's beyond space-time, God in theism definition is much greater than what pantheism believes. So there is a contradiction by definition. Yeah. So what do you think?
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you said about space and time.
Okay, I try to read it once more. Because I think if God beyond space-time, God in theism definition is much greater than what pantheism believes. So there is a contradiction by definition.
Oh, okay. So is this the idea that the definition of God underlying the ontological argument is not compatible with pantheism? Because if pantheism is true,
yes,
God is the universe, but the universe is constrained by space and time. But if God is the greatest possible being, then God should be beyond time and space. Therefore, pantheism might be incompatible with the Anselmian definition of God. Yeah, I really like that. I think that's a very good point. So traditional theists would say that God is the greatest possible being, and the greatest possible being should be spaceless and timeless. So we are limited beings because we are constrained by time and space. We are temporal beings, so we are beings, corporeal beings existing in space. But you might think that if there is the greatest possible being, this being should be beyond space and time. And if that's right, yeah, I think you're right that pantheism is not compatible with Anselm's definition of God. Very good point.
Yeah, okay. So that's why you talk that some other types of the model panentheism that more broad than the panentheism type of
so
God.
Model panentheists could say that their God is most comprehensive because it covers, all points in space and time, as well as everything beyond space and time as well. So in that sense, perhaps model panentheism is more attractive than pantheism.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to the next questions from Popo SJ. The ontological argument for my undergraduate thesis. I'm aware that he is not criticizing Anselm's argument, but Descartes and Leibniz argument of necessity. Kant's well-known thesis is being or existence sign is not a real predicate. How do you view Kant's refutations of the ontological argument? In your opinion, can his argument still be justified? What did he get right? What did he get wrong? Is his argument still relevant to us who talks about ontological argument?
Okay, so yeah, Kant famously said that the ontological argument is unsound because it's based on the wrong assumption that existence is a predicate. But Kant says that existence is not a predicate. So for example, we could say Samuel is smart, or Samuel has a headache, or whatever. We can ascribe these predicates to Samuel, but we don't say Samuel has a headache, but he doesn't exist. So existence is not like a property that you can add to beings like this. So in this sense, existence is very different from having knowledge or having these specific properties. And many people think that this is a definitive refutation of the ontological argument. But one possible response to this objection is to say that, okay, maybe existence is not a predicate, but necessary existence is a predicate. Because predicate or property is something that would characterize the uniqueness of the possessor of that predicate or property. Now, we are, again, contingent beings. We exist by accident or by chance. There are many possible worlds in which we don't exist. But if God is the greatest possible being, and if the greatest possible being exists in all possible worlds, and that's a very unique property that God has, which we don't have. So you might say, okay, even if existence isn't a property or predicate, necessary existence is a property or predicate. So that's one possible response to Kant. And also there is some dispute about whether or not existence is always not a predicate. Some philosophers of language claim that there are certain situations where we can treat existence as a predicate. So I would say Kant's objection to the ontological argument is quite powerful, but it's not definitive.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Other questions about Stephen Law's the absolute argument, and we once had Prof. Stephen Law to be interviewed also in Schole. According to Stephen Law, if the universe created by God, then that God is an evil God, judging the problem of evil in the world. Is it evil? Is it evil is a property of the greatest possible being, as defined on the classical and/or model ontological arguments of God? Arigato, from Benaya.
Okay. So I guess this is the problem of evil. So if God is the creator of the world, then the world contains evil. So you might think that God is evil as well, or at least God is not all-loving or not omnibenevolent. And yeah, I would say this is by far the greatest objection to theism in general. So I don't have a good response to the problem of evil, because I think this is a great challenge. And in some of my papers, I argued that okay, this is the problem. The problem of evil is a great challenge for theism, but also for other views as well. So there is a version of the problem of evil for pantheism, for instance. So if you say the universe is God, okay, the universe includes evil things and evil events, which means that God is at least partly evil. So how can we say that the universe is God? Or even in response to the modal panentheism, if we say God is logical space, then logical space includes all sorts of horrible things, not just horrible things in the actual universe, but horrible things, extremely horrible things, like innocent people are tortured for millions of years or something like that. So that's also a version of the problem of evil. So I think whatever view you defend, as long as you say this universe or this world was created by God, and if you think that God is meant to be all-loving, all morally perfect, and so on, then you have to face the problem of evil. And again, this is a great challenge for theists, especially. So I don't have a good, obvious response to this problem.
I remember that you once write about the problem of evil for atheists in your paper.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting also.
Good. So here's another unique move that I tried to make in that paper. So many people assume that, okay, theists are in trouble because they have to face the problem of evil. But I said that, okay, there is even a version of the problem of evil for atheists, because atheists are typically optimists like theists. So, there are very few extreme pessimists among atheists. So they think that even atheists typically think that life is overall good and the world is overall good as well, despite some pain and suffering in the world. But if we look at nature, it looks like natural selection is underlying our existence, and natural selection necessitates pain and suffering for millions of billions of organisms. So it looks like nature itself is quite evil and horrible. And how can we, accept optimism about life and the world? So potentially this is a challenge for atheists as well as theists. So I would say that you cannot just dismiss the problem of evil just because you are an atheist. So potentially there's a version of the problem of evil for you as an atheist as well.
Yeah. You guys, if you want to read, you could search the paper of Prof. Yujin, and also I think it's once interviewed by the Panpsychist podcast about Prof. Yujin paper on the problem of evil for atheists. Okay, I'll pick some other questions. This one is interesting questions from Josiah Lee. Since ontological argument based on logic, and logic are a result of reality which exists through logos, thus the concept of logos can serve as the meeting point between ontological argument and natural philosophy. Yeah.
I couldn't fully understand the question. What's the link between logos and the ontological argument here?
Yeah. I also a bit confused. Maybe Jesiah could explain more. Okay, I took other questions, Prof.
Okay.
Okay, this one. Hello, Prof. Nagasawa. I want to ask about theodicy. If we assume God is omniscient, then if God is most powerful, then he isn't most benevolent, vice versa. This is the same questions about What do you think is the solution? And do you think Gödel's incompleteness theorem is involved because he says formal system can be complete but inconsistent, or consistent but incomplete?
Okay, so in response to the first point, so these arguments against the existence of God, they almost always try to focus on God's omniscience or omnipotence or omnibenevolence. So they might say the problem of evil is a good example. So he says that theists cannot maintain that God is omnipotent and omnibenevolent, because if God is omnipotent, then he should be able to eliminate evil in this world. But if God is omnibenevolent, then he should be willing to eliminate evil in this world. But there is evil in this world, therefore God cannot be both omnipotent and omnibenevolent. Or there's another argument which I call the argument from God's inability to sin, which says that if God is omnipotent, then he should be able to do something really horrible. But if God is omnibenevolent, then he shouldn't be able to do something really horrible, even in principle. So again, omnipotence and omnibenevolence are incompatible. And in response to these arguments, I argue in my book that, God is the greatest possible being, but if these arguments are really right in saying that omnipotence and omnibenevolence are logically incompatible, then maybe God is not exactly omnipotent or not exactly omnibenevolent. But God still has the maximum consistent set of these attributes. So if you make a ranking of all possible beings, God is still the very best being, the greatest possible being. But it's a further question whether this being should be exactly omniscient or exactly omnipotent and so on. Because there are some arguments to show that actually some of these attributes, omnipotence and omnibenevolence, or omniscience and omnipotence and so on, they are incompatible, or these each of these properties is somehow logically problematic. So there is the paradox of the stone, which says that the concept of omnipotence is internally self-contradictory because God cannot create a stone that he cannot lift, or no being can create a stone that he or she cannot lift. So yeah, so in response to this kind of paradox, what we can say is that, okay, maybe if this paradox is right, God is not omnipotent, but that doesn't mean that God is not the greatest possible being. About Gödel's incompleteness theorem, I'm not sure how we can apply Gödel's theorems to philosophy, but yeah, there is a worry about appealing to logic. So maybe it's a little bit related to what Samuel asked at the end of the earlier interview, but analytic philosophers tend to appeal to logic and reason, but you might think that there is a certain limit here as well. So we cannot prove absolutely everything within logic. And here, some people might appeal to some sort of experiential approach to ultimate reality or something like that. Mystics might appeal to that kind of approach.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Yujin, for the response. I'm gonna pick one last question. I was just from Rifki. I just wondering how to defend the idea of the possibility that God exists and draw that idea aside from fallacy. For example, in connection with the idea of miracles, how can we draw logical reasoning about the existence of God and distinguish it from the logic of conspiracy or the illusory correlation? How can we defend the argument that God exists and how people in the midst of that pandemic, when the most reliable explanations come from the scientists, not theists? I think this is the quite same questions about evil and so on and so on. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
You want to answer it? Yeah.
Yeah. So this what we are facing in the midst of this pandemic crisis. I think this is a vivid illustration of the problem of evil. And so atheists would say that this is a very strong case against God, because in the whole world right now, there are a lot of people who need help from God. They want a miraculous cure from COVID-19, but obviously there is no help from God. So this is certainly a challenge for theists. And again, I cannot pretend that there is some amazing, obvious solution to the problem of evil. The Archbishop of Canterbury, when there was this horrible tsunami and earthquake in Southeast Asia a few years ago, he said that it's actually morally wrong to pretend that there is some obvious philosophical solution to this kind of problem. So you'll be wrong if I say, oh, don't worry about this pandemic problem. I have a philosophical solution, and I can show you exactly how God is compatible with this, pain and suffering of millions of people. And that's almost immoral. And this kind of idea is called anti-theodicy. So I'm inclined to think that these theodicies are philosophical responses to the problem of evil, and it's not the practical response. So it doesn't really offer practical solution to the problem of evil.
Thank you, Prof. Yujin. I think it's really, it's really wise, and I think we could think about that. Yeah, it's not an answer to some practical problems, especially in this pandemic era. Okay, there is another question, but I think it's the same questions that you have answered before regarding that we can imagine that this greatest possible being could also be the most evil God, or the most other negative aspect of morality that could ever have. How do we respond towards this?
So is this the idea that the greatest possible being should be most evil?
Yeah, we could say that that we can imagine that the greatest possible being with also the base morality in positive and also in the negative. I mean, the negative are the most good, the most benevolence, and etc.
Yeah, so I think this is related to a tricky question about how can we know which properties are meant to be great? So, even if you accept the Anselmian definition of God as the greatest possible being, it's very difficult to see exactly what kind of properties are meant to be great. Theists typically assume that God is, all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving, because these properties are meant to be great-making properties. But you can, always dispute. So you might think that actually the greatest possible being should be most evil or something like that. Or you can even make a parallel parody. And maybe this is what Stephen Law has in mind. So if there is a successful or potentially successful ontological argument for the existence of God, then maybe there is a parallel parody of the ontological argument for the most evil being or something like that. And I would say it is a good question, exactly how we can define God's greatness. And Anselm's definition itself is absent about exactly what properties should be considered great and how we can decide which properties are great and which properties are not.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. Yujin. I think that's enough questions for Prof. Yujin. Ambadia, you want to add some questions or statements?
Yeah, thank you. So all of these questions are very interesting and impressive, and I'm really delighted that there are a lot of Indonesian scholars who are interested in the ontological argument.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed this discussion. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's really great, Prof. Yujin, to see that despite this pandemic is going, we could. There's some festival, online philosophy festival happened in Indonesia, and around 25,000 watching the festival. Wow. And it's really great also to have you here.
Yeah, that's very impressive.
Yeah. So before we end this discussion, I want to encourage you guys to see some of Prof. Yujin writings in yujinnagasawa.co.uk. You can see some papers or some books that he has already published, and maybe you could consider to buy or to download it from the store. Article from store, etc. And finish it. I watched it first from the Google Talks about miracles, and I think you guys to read also this miracles, very short introductions from Prof. Yujin. You could buy this at Kinokuniya bookstore. So thank you, Prof. Yujin, for your willingness to join at Schole Indonesia.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hopefully we could have another opportunities to talk.
Yes. Stay in touch.
Oke, Dek, boleh di-end aja. Dek, silakan di-end aja. You could just, and okay.